In today's episode, I'll talk about two very interesting stories. In the first one of the day, I'll talk about why companies like Samsung and LG are fighting India's new e-waste rule and what this reveals about the messiness of our recycling system. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about how aging populations are very quietly changing the global economy and why that might not be such a bad thing as many economic theories suggest. Welcome to the Daily Brief show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I am your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Monday, the 28th of April. See, Samsung and LG, which are two of the world's biggest electronic companies, are suing the Indian government. And the reason is a new rule that forces companies to pay a fixed fee of 22 rupees per kg to recyclers for electronic waste. Now, at first look, I know this might sound like a very boring and bureaucratic decision to you, but the thing is that it goes much deeper than that. It actually touches the heart of how India deals with its mountains of old phones, broken laptops, discarded TVs, and other electronics. And this one rule that I'm talking about is now suddenly at the center of a major fight between big businesses, government regulators, and the massive but still very invisible world of informal recycling. Let me start with the very beginning. See, India is the third largest generator of electronic waste in the entire world, right after China and the US. Every year, we produce over 3 million tons of e-waste. Now, this includes everything from smartphones that no longer work to fridges and air conditioners that people threw out after a few years of using it. But despite this enormous volume of junk, less than half of it is actually recycled properly. Around 43% of it goes through formal recycling channels, and the rest of it actually disappears into the informal sector, which includes local scrapyards, small kabadiwalas, and dismantling units in places like Silampur near Delhi. Now, this place called Silampur in particular is infamous. In a report by journalist Pankaj Mishra, it was described as India's digital underbelly. There, in very narrow lanes that are choked with wires, fans, and circuit boards, men and children sit around piles of e-waste and they break them apart by their hand. They basically use acid to extract silver and gold from motherboards, and they melt cables with open flames to retrieve copper. Now, of course, this is extremely dangerous work. The air is toxic, and workers who sometimes earn as little as 200 rupees a day are exposed to mercury, lead, and cadmium. Now, some of them, of course, fall ill, and others live with chronic breathing problems as a result of all of this. And yet, as one worker reportedly said, e-waste is just the new waste. We've been doing this for generations now. So basically, this is the world that the government now wants to reform. In 2022, India introduced a new set of e-waste management rules, and these came into full effect in 2023. At the very center of this policy is something called Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. Now, this is a very straightforward idea. If you make or sell electronics, you are also responsible for what happens to those products after people throw them away. So if a company like Samsung or LG, for example, sells you a TV, they are now suddenly legally responsible for ensuring that that particular TV gets collected and also safely recycled when the life dies. And to top it up, in late 2024, the government added a clause that triggered the current legal battle that I'm speaking about. It said that companies must pay at least 22 rupees per kg to registered recyclers for the e-waste that they collect and process. Now, this is not a suggested rate, mind you, it is a mandatory floor. Even if a recycler is okay doing the work for 10 rupees, the company is not allowed to pay less than 22 rupees. And if they fail to meet their recycling targets, they could be fined 74 rupees or more per kilogram. Now, the idea behind this rule is to clean up the entire industry. Context is that for years, the companies have been outsourcing their e-waste handling to the informal sector, sometimes directly so as well, and sometimes maybe indirectly. They'd pay as little as 5 to 6 rupees per kg to small-time dismantlers. And these dismantlers in turn would cut corners, they would use unsafe methods, and would create huge environmental damage in the entire process. The government believes that this race to the bottom has basically made proper recycling financially unviable. So by setting a higher floor price, they basically hope to professionalize the system and push out dangerous practices. But of course, companies are pushing back. Samsung argues that this 22 rupees per kg mandate could raise their recycling cost by 5 to 15 times even. And LG, on the other hand, says that this has nothing to do with real environmental goals and everything to do with extracting money from companies under the pretext of polluter pays. Basically, their core argument is that the government has failed to build a proper recycling ecosystem and now it is unfairly asking them to foot the bill to fix it. And if you look at how India's recycling supply chain works, their frustration starts to make some level of sense. The actual flow of e-waste in India is very complex and layered. It begins when consumers throw out their devices. Now, these are usually picked up not by formal collection agents but by local kabadiwalas who are essentially your local neighborhood scrap dealers. And these kabadiwalas eventually pass the waste on. Now, ideally speaking, this should go to formal dismantlers and recyclers who follow environmental rules and guidelines. But more often than not, it ends up with informal dismantlers who manually take the gadget apart to extract anything valuable. Only much later does this stripped down waste reach a formal recycler. Now, formal recyclers definitely exist, and some are actually trying to do things the right way as well, but most of them don't have the advanced machinery that is really required to handle the hazardous waste or recover rare earth metals safely. And even worse, most of them still depend on the informal sector to get the actual waste. According to a 2024 report by ICRIER, over 90% of India's e-waste collection and dismantling in India is still done informally, which is quite scary to say the least. So the strange reality is that the formal sector exists on paper and even has licenses for sure, but the heavy lifting, which is picking up junk, sorting it, dismantling it and other things, still happens in the shadows, which is in the informal sectors. Now, the law does not acknowledge this for sure. The 22 rupees per kg rule is only for registered recyclers. The law does not even recognize the kabadiwala who picked up the waste or the informal dismantler who extracted that copper. And as a result, a huge chunk of the actual ecosystem is not even a part of this new system. And the people doing the hardest work are actually out of the picture completely at this point. And this, of course, creates a major blind spot. Adding to the confusion is the lack of proper infrastructure as well. Setting up recycling hubs, smelting units, and advanced dismantling facilities obviously needs massive amount of investments. But so far, the government has not made any serious financial commitments. A report by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs admits that these so-called eco parks are just still pilot projects of sorts. Meanwhile, companies are expected to somehow deliver magical results in a system that barely even exists. Even the EPR rules are very vague. They tell companies what percentage of their waste they need to recycle. They tell them to work with government-approved recyclers, but they don't even explain how to get that waste. Can companies work with informal collectors? Can they count that towards their recycling targets? All of that is really unclear. Then there is also a layer of intermediaries called the PROs, or the Producer Responsibility Organizations. Now, these are basically supposed to act as intermediaries who connect brands with recyclers, but their role is also not clearly defined in this case. The credit system they operate under is very opaque, and instead of building a healthy ecosystem, the whole thing sort of sometimes turns into rent seeking. The companies end up overpaying just so that they can avoid penalties. And if you compare this to how things work in other countries, in the US, there is no single national e-waste law. Each state does its own thing, and some like California and New York have good EPR laws while the others do not. Manufacturers are basically expected to fund recycling, but they are also allowed to negotiate rates with recyclers or pay based on how much they sell. There is no price floor, and in some places, consumers pay a small fee when buying electronics, which is then used for recycling, and the market basically handles the pricing in short. And China, on the other hand, runs a more centralized model. The government collects a recycling fee from electronic companies almost like a tax. This money is then put into a national fund, and recyclers who follow the rules can then claim subsidies from this particular fund. So companies don't really directly pay recyclers, they actually pay into the system, and the government then redistributes the money in the way they require. Now, mind you, both of these systems also have their flaws. The US struggles with inconsistency, while China faces problems like subsidy fraud. But the thing is, both of them have one thing that India does not, which is a functional infrastructure and clear flows of responsibility. And that brings me to the main issue that I'm talking about. The Indian government's policy is definitely well-intentioned because it wants to clean up the mess that we have. It wants to push companies to take responsibility, but the problem is that it is trying to do this with price controls, vague rules, weak infrastructure, and almost zero inclusion of the informal sector, which for better or worse still runs the show in our country. And if you talk about the companies, Samsung and LG are fighting the 22 rupees per kg rule in court. But maybe that's not the most important part of the story at all. Maybe the real question we should be asking is, how do we build a recycling system that does not depend on, say, a 9-year-old girl melting circuit boards in a very toxic alley just so that she can extract gold from a phone that somebody like you or I threw away? Because the truth is that unless we fix that, no rule, no matter how strict it is, can ever clean up the mess. On that note, let's move on to the second story of the day and talk about what an old and aging population could mean for the world's economy. Now, that's a very interesting question, especially in the field of economics, and that's also interestingly a question that the IMF or the International Monetary Fund is trying to answer in the second chapter of its World Economic Outlook report. And the answers are both worrying and surprisingly also interestingly hopeful. But before I get into the details, let's take a quick step back and understand what's all of this even about. See, every few months, the IMF publishes a detailed report on how the global economy is doing, where it is headed, and what risks or opportunities that lie ahead for us. Now, earlier this month, they released their flagship report, which is called the World Economic Outlook, and in it, they devoted an entire chapter to something called the silver economy. Now, for your context, this is a phrase that economists use to describe the growing economic footprint of older people and the adjustments that societies will need to make as the world generally gets older. Now, you might be thinking, why is this even such a big deal? See, that is because for the first time in history, aging is no longer a rich country problem, it is actually a global problem. Now, there could be multiple reasons for this, which I will not get into in detail, but one of them could definitely be rising costs of having children in the first place. Plus, also, birth control has become more accessible across the world, housing is getting more and more expensive, and many people are simply choosing to have smaller families just by preference. But on the other hand, improvements in healthcare and nutrition mean that people are generally living longer than they ever did. And the result of all of that is that the average age of the global population is expected to go up by 11 years between 2020 and 2100. And mind you, this is not limited to countries like Japan or Germany anymore like it earlier used to be. By 2035, as per estimates, most advanced and major emerging economies will hit something called their demographic turning point. Now, this is a point where the proportion of working age people starts shrinking. Even low-income countries that are currently seen as young will start aging very rapidly by the 2070s. In fact, by the end of the century, global population growth will slow down to nearly zero as per estimates. Now, this is a very strange thing to picture, especially for us in India, where it always feels like there are more people around every single year. But take a moment and imagine a world where schools start shutting down because there is a lack of students, where retirement homes outnumber kindergartens, and where public parks are actually filled with more walkers and wheelchairs rather than children who are playing around. Now, that is not a sci-fi scenario, ladies and gentlemen. That is almost like the direction that we are headed in across the world. So the question is, why does it matter to the economy? See, that is because aging really changes how entire economies behave. A younger population tends to fuel growth because more workers, more consumers, and more innovation in general. But when a country starts to age, things start slowing down. The IMF estimates that global economic growth could fall by around 1.1 percentage points annually between 2025 and 2050 compared to how things look pre-pandemic. And by the end of the century, this particular growth could reach 2 percentage points. And the effects don't even stop at GDP growth. They also ripple into every other part of the economy. Interest rates, for example, might stay low for longer as older populations save more and invest less. Government finances will also come under stress as countries spend more on pensions and healthcare, but they collect less from a shrinking workforce. Public debt might also rise unless governments actually start balancing their budgets a lot better than they currently do. Also, pension systems which rely on today's workers funding today's retirees will also start to come under immense strain because the number of retirees would start outgrowing the number of workers who are in a shrinking number. But that's not even all. There is also a bigger shift in global capital. Countries like India and China, which are still relatively younger, mind you, may start accumulating more foreign assets over time. And meanwhile, aging economies like that of Germany or Japan might begin selling off their overseas investments in order to pay for their domestic needs. Now, this could completely sort of reshape how money flows across the world. But before this starts sounding all very doomsday-ish, let me talk about the other side of the story. See, the IMF is not saying that the future is doomed as such. In fact, they're actually very optimistic about one particular development here, which is healthy aging. Now, this is the part that really flips the entire narrative all of a sudden. See, the thing is that it's not just that the people are living longer, they are also staying healthier both physically and mentally much later in life. Between the year 2000 and 2022, researchers across 41 different countries looked at health data from people over the age of 50, including things like how strong they were, how sharp their memory was, and how they rated their own health. And the results were very interesting. Seniors today are doing far better than their counterparts 2 decades ago. For example, a 70-year-old in 2022 had the same average cognitive capacity as a 53-year-old in the year 2000. And these kind of insights sort of change everything all of a sudden. Basically, when people age healthily, they can continue working, earning, and even contributing for much longer in their life. The report I'm referring to shows that healthy seniors are 20 percentage points more likely to stay in the workforce, they work around 6 hours more per week, and earn nearly 30% more than others their age. They also retire later and they face less unemployment. And all of this means that healthy aging is not just good for people, it is good for the economy in general. In fact, the IMF believes that this could add 0.4 percentage points to global GDP growth every single year from 2025 to 2050. And that, mind you, is a very big deal. It's almost like unlocking a new source of growth magically at a time when most others, at least by the looks of it, are drying up. There is also a very interesting picture of how AI fits into this entire picture. See, usually when people talk about artificial intelligence in jobs, they focus on how young and tech-savvy workers will benefit or how older workers will be left behind, as has been the case with other forms of technology. But the IMF report actually suggests something very, very different here. It says that many jobs are likely to be shaped by AI also happen to align with older workers' preferences, which is less physical strain, more flexible work, and tasks that benefit from experience and judgment. Now, of course, adapting to AI will not be easy for everyone, especially those who have not worked with technology as much. But if governments manage to design the right support systems like training programs and easier to use tools, older workers can actually start to thrive in this new looking environment. But still, all that said and done, the story is not entirely rosy. Even if individuals are healthier, aging societies may still face lower innovation and productivity. Younger people by nature tend to take more risks, start more companies, and push technological barriers. So when their share in population starts to shrink, you also lose some of that natural energy. And that is why aging could not just affect how much we work, but also how creatively and effectively we do that entire work. One of the more eye-opening parts of the entire report is a graph that compares how different countries perform on cognitive health for their elderly. It adjusts for personal traits and tries to isolate what a country's systems, which is healthcare, education, income support, etc., are doing in order to help or hurt older adults' brain health. And India, unfortunately, ranks at the very bottom of this. Why, you might ask? It's not just about our current GDP levels. The reasons actually go far deeper into our country's past and how it shaped today's seniors. See, for starters, most elderly Indians grew up when access to quality education was very limited in our country. In the 1950s and 60s, illiteracy rates were very, very low. Fewer than 3 in 10 Indians could actually read or write. And that early disadvantage has almost like a lifelong effect on brain development. Then there is the issue of long-term poverty and undernutrition. Even if many Indians are better off today as we speak, the older generation spent their formative years in environments that lacked proper food, healthcare, and economic security. And as per studies, these effects do not tend to go away. Studies have shown strong links between lifelong poverty and lower cognitive health in old age. Healthcare access is another factor here. Data suggests that most older Indians live in rural areas where it is harder to get treated for age-related conditions, which, if left unmanaged, can actually impact brain health. And if you add this to the rural-urban divide and gender inequality in our country, the picture starts to get even more stark. Older women, especially in rural India, are much more likely to face cognitive decline because they had even fewer educational and economic opportunities in the past. So the question then becomes, what can really be done? See, the IMF lays out a series of policy suggestions as well. First, invest in preventive healthcare, things like regular checkups, vaccination, mental health care services, and public awareness about aging well. Second, encourage people to work longer, not by forcing them, but by making it easier through flexible hours, phased retirement options, and incentives to postpone retirement. Third, reduce the gender gap in workforce participation, especially in countries like India, by improving parental leave, childcare, and work-life flexibility. Basically, if countries follow this through, the economic benefits could be absolutely massive. Not only could we manage the costs of aging, we could actually end up growing stronger economies because of this. So basically, at the center of this entire discussion is a very, very clear message. Yes, the world is aging, but it does not mean that it is declining. All of it actually depends on the opportunities we cash on next. That brings me to the end of the 2 stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, Axis Bank reported a net profit of 7,118 crore rupees for Q4 of FY 2025, nearly unchanged from 7,129 crore rupees in the same quarter last year. The flat performance was largely due to a sharp decline in trading income, which dropped to 173 crore rupees from 1,021 crore rupees, and a rise in loan loss provisions to 1,369 crore rupees from 832 crore rupees. Second, Air India is in discussions with Boeing to acquire approximately 10 737 MAX aircrafts originally meant for Chinese customers who are now rejecting deliveries due to ongoing trade tensions between the US and China. The jets are being considered for Air India Express, which is the airline's low-cost arm with a fleet of over 100 aircrafts. Third, Prestige Hospitality Ventures, which is the hospitality arm of real estate developer Prestige Estates, has filed draft papers for an initial public offering worth 2,700 crore rupees. The IPO will comprise a fresh issue of shares worth 1,700 crore rupees and an offer for sale by the parent company amounting to 1,000 crore rupees. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this show. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.